Amid the rising tensions between China and the United States, Chinese ministries are raising more voices in response to what they call false claims and inappropriate tactics by the other side. Specifically, the Ministry of Commerce published a report on China-U.S. economic and trade cooperation, pointing to the fact that the U.S. has made huge profits from the bilateral trade. The Ministry of Education warned the Chinese students who plan to study in the U.S. of increasing risks of visa delays and denials, despite the welcoming and friendly gestures from American universities. The Ministry of Culture and Tourism also reminded the Chinese tourists to fully assess the risks of going to the U.S., considering potential safety threats and unwarranted interrogation. So where are we heading with China-U.S. relations? How have the rocky bilateral relations affected the Chinese living in the United States and Americans living in China? How are individuals being dragged into disputes originating in economy and security? To discuss these issues and more, for the first part of the program, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics and Rick Dunham, visiting scholar at Tsinghua University. We'll also speak via satellite to Dr. Aravind Yalari, Senior Fellow at HSBC Business School of Peking University. For the second part, we shall continue the discussion with Rick Dunham and Dr. Aravind Yalari, and we'll also be joined by Han Hua, Research Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies of Renmin University. And on Skype to Henry Kong, an undergraduate student at Pennsylvania State University. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome back. Rick, the Chinese government decides to fight back with a report, particularly on how much the U.S. has benefited from the bilateral relationship economically over the past 40 years, particularly since China's entry into the WTO. Do you think there's any ring of truth in what China says on the benefits the U.S. enjoys?
Well, there's a ring of truth because Chinese tourism in the U.S. benefits the U.S. economy very much. Chinese students attending universities help a lot of state universities and smaller private universities keep afloat in a time where some universities are going out of business. I think it's really overstated to say that the U.S. benefits more from the trade relationship than China. Of course, there is a big trade deficit and there are legitimate issues that are being negotiated, but I think that the side where the U.S. has benefited hasn't been talked about as much because Donald Trump and his negotiators are talking about all the bad things.
Professor Liu.
Well, trade is conducted on a mutual benefit basis. We shouldn't really distinguish who is really benefiting more because it's really consumers, business people who are really making voluntary decisions. However, the two biggest economies are having a constructive engagement in all rounds, and particularly in terms of the trade and economic investments. So that's something that's really critically required, particularly after the financial crisis. And the U.S. economy does really need to push forward a structural change to accommodate the entire supply chain. It's just really the response to the globalization process that really makes a difference. China proactively, embraced the globalization, so China gets really rising very quickly. But some of the conservatives would rather, they blame the globalization process and trying to retreat into a turf. So that really brings the country into a more the difficult situation. So that's why politicians receive a lot of backlash at home.
Let me go to Aravind, who's standing by in Guangzhou, an Indian scholar. Hello, Aravind. How do you see this chronic issue of trade imbalance between the two countries? Do you think the United States has benefited enormously, or it has so much to lose that the grievances from Washington should be justified at this particular defining moment?
I certainly endorse the report brought out by the Ministry of Commerce, and I say that it is not only the near future but in earlier cases as well. U.S. economy has been benefited immensely by non-U.S. immigrant population who went to U.S., studied there and worked, started their own entrepreneur activities in the United States. So I think it is not just because trade relations shape or the trade relation between U.S.-China, but going beyond that, U.S. has already been benefited from such interactions, and it cannot really stand out and take a regressive policy at this point of time when a larger part of the world is looking up to more globalized activities, commerce and trade, and it is very unfortunate from the U.S. side that they have been very selective in this process.
The Ministry of Commerce in Beijing also delivered 3 cases of the U.S. violating rules. Ruben, did you notice this accusation by the Chinese side?
Actually, and this is not only from the Chinese side. We have seen globally also the U.S. companies have been going overboard, violating and tampering some of the rules of the homeland. Even if case about China, if it is case about South Asia, in India specific. So I think it is a time if U.S. is trying to be selective in its policies to benefit immensely from the globalized world, the rest of the world needs to rethink their policies towards becoming over-dependent on U.S. economy or trade with United States per se.
Thank you so much for being with us. Professor Liu, the United States always says that it is important to abide by rules in a rules-based world. However, look at the impact of a unilateral withdrawal from so many multilateral commitments by the United States. Do you think there are reasons for Beijing to hit back and say, hey, look at your bad example?
Yeah, the Trump administration is like now a big elephant in a China shop, so where they just want to dismantle everything. But right now they do not really have a clear direction what would be an economic order globally run that the U.S. can participate and possibly maintain its leadership. And so it's easy to complain. Of course, there are some problems going on in the global structure, but you need really to bring something that is really constructive. So now, they are retreating back to say, okay, let's do it on bilateral basis because I have a bigger size, so therefore I can get an upper hand over negotiation table. And this is not really the spirit of American forefathers have given to this nation. And so they are really renegating on the basic principles of the United States. And also the rule of law, is a fundamental factor to support U.S. leadership and to support U.S. innovation. But it seems that now politics now is stepping beyond the border of rule of law. So this is very risky. It's really something, it's a jeopardy in the U.S. core value, and also the risk, invading into the U.S. Constitution in some of the cases, not only against Chinese companies like Huawei, but also in many other cases. So I think the people with the right mind, people with the ration, people with the responsibility should really respond and fight against such sort of trend.
Rick, what do you think of public sentiments which might be viewed as loose sand for the rise of populism, particularly in the underdeveloped Midwest, the Rust Belt, for example? White deplorables complain bitterly about their jobs being outsourced in the process of globalization, hence the trade war between the 2 biggest economies.
That part is true. There is a backlash now. It's similar to the backlash of the 1980s and 90s with the decline of manufacturing. At that point, Japan was the big enemy in that part of the country. I think Donald Trump is taking advantage of the dislocation. But I agree with my colleague here. One of the fundamental problems is the United States has not embraced globalization in terms of supply chain. And right now, what is happening is that China and the U.S. are both thinking about having supply chains that avoid these trade wars by excluding the other countries, sort of have 2 parallel global supply chains. I don't think that's efficient. I don't think that's good for the country, for the world. I think what would be best is to negotiate the differences instead of calling on populism and nationalism in both countries. I think it's destructive. It's destructive of the economies. It's destructive of globalization. Let's hope that we don't have this kind of immature behavior by the Trump administration continuing, and then tit-for-tat reactions. China has never taken the next step to make this trade war worse, but every time the Trump administration turns the screws, China turns the screws too, and that's bad. Each time it's bad.
Yeah, to add on to your point, actually, it's American two major movements that kicked American business away from their own country. One is the environmental protection movement that started particularly from the 70s of the last century, and also the labor movement, because they demand higher salaries. So business people, they have their own calculations, so therefore they go for lower environmental standard and cheaper labor cost. And then they picked the four Asian dragons in the first place, and when China was fully open, India was open, so they shipped their allocation over here. It's not really China that is really crafting a conspiracy to capture American businesses.
With the G20 summit around the corner in Japan, many observers, Chinese and foreign alike, keep their eyes on the agenda between President Xi Jinping and his American counterpart and try to figure out if an agreement is likely to be inked between the two countries to avert a trade war that would be damaging to both sides. When we come back, we'll look at why Chinese students are warned by the Ministry of Education in China of increasing risks, and what does that mean for the people-to-people exchange across the Pacific Ocean. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We are happy to be joined here by Rick Dunham, Han Hua, and Henry Kong, as well as Dr. Aravind Yalare, who's standing by in Guangzhou. Welcome to our discussion, the second part of our program, particularly with a focus on what's going to happen to Chinese students.
I mean, there is a rational reason, and that is that the U.S. government is doing two things. The State Department under Donald Trump, it is slow walking approvals of visas, meaning that it's taking longer for students to get visas, but also it's rejecting more. I mean, we've gone from 2 to 3% to 12, 13%, and that's problematic for Chinese students. U.S. universities rely on a lot of Chinese students, both for diversity and for money, and so U.S. is vulnerable if the number of Chinese students drops. So it's both their legitimate concerns, and it's a place where the United States can be hit in the trade war.
When you look at what happened 40 years ago, the normalization of the bilateral relationship during the Carter administration, one of the first things the two sides did was to encourage people-to-people exchange, particularly encouraging Chinese students to go to the States to find the American dream. So what's going to happen next?
Yes, I can feel the trend. So in the 40 years ago, you can tell that talents first, then trade, and also the technology exchange and cooperation follows. But now here we see the trade war first, followed by the technology barriers to be set up high and higher, and then now the people-to-people exchange, all the talents exchange to be stopped. It's not a good sign, because we see that talents have always contributed to this kind of country-to-country exchange and cooperation much. And for Chinese students, they all have this, because of the college entrance examination, the system are too different, so that people, especially the Chinese young talents, have been putting a lot of efforts in getting into American top universities. So this is really a huge blow to them if their visa applications are kind of slowed or even revoked. That is a huge blow to their whole academic pursuit of a higher education. So I really think that two governments need to sit down and to negotiate about not to discourage but encourage the people-to-people exchange on this regard.
Other than worries of Chinese parents, let's look at how Chinese student in the State University of Pennsylvania looks at this issue. Henry, tell us whether you have those fears about the delays and denials in the visa process.
Well, I think there might not be too much influences on all Chinese students, but except the government-sponsored scholars, because many of their friends have already got admitted or enrolled in their graduate schools or doctor programs But I do know somebody who's studying in the STEM fields, in AI, in the chemistry, in nuclear engineering. Their visa application has been double-checked and postponed. So as for me, I'm currently in my senior year and I will graduate in very, very soon. I can't tell whether I will stay in the States for long in the future because I need to make more like plan Bs in Canada, in Singapore, or back to China just because of the visa issues.
Thank you so much. What do you think of the speech delivered by Chancellor Angela Merkel at Harvard University to address a big, brilliant young audience, talking about how to reject the establishment of wars, be it the Berlin War or the war against the free trade? She was talking to students, and what kind of message do you think she delivered to the younger generation?
I think that can be regarded as an open criticism to this Trump administration and encouraging students, not only from Harvard graduates, but also students with the wise mentality to keep going on, in their different job occupations to move towards the globalization, maybe the next stage, despite this challenging circumstances. And I want to add that American First by this Trump administration cannot be realized, in my opinion, with only American talents. American success is built on Americans' core value is to have all the world's talents to go to the United States, to contribute, but also vice versa. So maybe it is a very good opportunity for China to welcome more international students and talents to come to China.
Rick, in the statement, the ministry reminds students and scholars to raise their risk assessment, strengthen their preventive awareness, and make appropriate preparations, particularly with regard of what they call interrogation. What do you think of this policy gesture by the State Department and the frontier cops?
Well, I think that there are rare, most of the examples of what we would call interrogation have been people at the Mexican border. There have been some Chinese scholars. I have not really heard of examples of Chinese students. Again, I think this is ratcheting up the pressure. I don't think Chinese students need to be worried about crime in America any more than ever before. I think that people need to be aware because the nationalistic fervor has led to some people who want to confront the other side. But I think we should downplay this. I mean, everyone should be aware. If you're a Chinese student going to America, you should be aware that there could be someone who's very nationalistic who says racist things. I don't think there's a safety issue. I don't think we should raise the level to say American students should worry about coming to China, Chinese students or Indian students worry about coming to America.
Han-Hua and Rick, what do you think of the latest policy move by the State Department asking applicants for American visas to submit all their social media accounts like Weibo, WeChat, Twitter, Facebook? Is that an effort to curb terrorism, or is that an effort of intelligence gathering? Because that's pretty scary for Chinese applicants.
I would call that harassment. I mean, that one, it's clearly harassment. Yes, it's intelligence gathering, but mostly it's lazy. I mean, if the U.S. government wanted to investigate every Chinese student, they could have somebody do the work. It's like you're asking Chinese students to work for U.S. intelligence. I mean, I don't see any reason why U.S. government should ask for that. It's an invasion of privacy. It's un-American. There's not a question of national security like terrorism. I mean, it's not like after September 11th and you're worried about terrorist attacks.
Do you think this amounts to a declaration of an emergency? You cannot call that a curfew, but it's something like a wartime emergency state, citing the excuse of national security.
First, this kind of new requirements added to visa application is more like a signal or gesture by Trump administration, which is in line with its remarks, statements, or consensus regarding China's threat, a trade surplus, a trade deficit from the U.S. side, everything. Because technically or in practice, it's really hard for their customs customs or the law enforcement parties to do that kind of check one by one, because most of these social networking things are conducted in Chinese, and they don't have this enough staff to do that. So it's mainly a spiritual or mental, signal sending from this administration to enhance the consensus reached within the administration to let Chinese know, oh, we're in a trade war, so everything needs to be taken care of as a threat. So this is, for me, as a Chinese, it is really a kind of intrusion of privacy.
Let me go back to Dr. Yellery. Some 10 years ago, I did an interview with the former president of India who was searched, whose body was searched by American frontier cops, and this caused an uproar in the Indian media about what they call humiliation of a senior politician in your country. Today, we are facing much the same problem of interrogation, and guest speakers here in the Beijing studio said this amounts to intrusion of privacy. What do you think of what happens in this regard?
Certainly, it's intrusion in your privacy. When you talked about the U.S. policy asking Chinese students to submit their social media accounts, I mean, this is not new to Indian students. I mean, I remember in the last 2 years, Indian students have invariably been asked to submit account details of this thing. This is certainly an intrusion. I mean, there is long clarity over when someone goes and applies for U.S. visa, and you're asking more details or more information about it. It's some kind of a humiliation. And since you have brought up about case about interrogation of Indian politicians, not Indian politicians, about Bollywood actors also who are quite famous, but the borderland. When you enter the border in the United States, there are many occasions, not one, but many occasions where they have been stopped, interrogated for not 1-2 minutes, but about for hours. I think this is literally regressive from the U.S. side. Are they literally representing the world when they call themselves a single power? I think it's not something. It represents a certain psyche of a section in the United States, which represents that U.S. has two faces. One is represented by the present regime and those who selected them, and then the other one where they're talking against the present regime and asking them to be progressive globally and domestically as well. That's what I can say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yellery. Rick, the United States has been very proud of being a melting pot and a nation of immigration. But today, it seems that President Trump is erecting walls of different kinds. This invisible wall of visa barriers is viewed as an embarrassing blow to the reputation and credibility of the United States as a melting pot. What do you think of the future? There seems to be a lot of unpredictability on the policy of immigration. Do you think the U.S. government will close the door, or do you think by the next government, should Democrats be voted into the White House, do you think this is likely to be changed?
I think Donald Trump is yelling into the wind. He's the past. The future is diversity. The United States will be a minority country by 2050. Younger generation now, younger voters, are already a minority. The United States has always been a country of immigrants. The difference is now the immigrants are not immigrants from Europe, the quote white people. They're immigrants from Africa, immigrants from Asia, immigrants from all over the world. And that can't be stopped. It can be slowed. You can empower the racists. You can harass people. You can harass students. They won't stop, because America is diverse, and America is not Donald Trump.
Thank you so much. In fact, 18 American presidents came from Ireland, which only boasts of 4 million people. And that somehow showcases the importance of having immigration to show up the morale and the image of the United States as superpower at the end of the Cold War. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.